Shafi'i school don't think of it as a wajib of the Hanafi school. They actually are different. Okay, so let's look at fard, the obligations itself in the Hanafi school. Firstly, a fard are those kind of acts which are determined based on decisive texts. In other words, there is clear evidence in the text of the Quran and Sunnah for it to become a fard, and there is no opportunity for various forms of interpretation thereof. Like a very simple example of that will be to actually pray your prayer at prescribed times. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in this Quran that the prayers actually have prescribed times. Then the Prophet ﷺ explains to us about those prescribed times. Secondly, performance of fard acts out of obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, out of your, the word ta'ah, the word obedience is not a kind of an obedience, well, I really don't want to do it, but I have to obey him. Okay, that's called coercion. Okay. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not coercing you. Obedience here meaning is because you love him. Right? A very simple analogy of that is that if we are sane people, and inshallah we all are, you know, when you go and do your exams at school and then you go home and you know your exam marks are not the best, you have that kind of a gut feeling that, you know, your parents might not be happy with you because you want to please them. That's the point here. You know, that you love your parents, you don't want to let them down. Right? So obedience, ta'ah, is that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's not a relationship of coercion at all. So performance of fard acts out of obedience is rewarded by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and if it is left out without a valid excuse, it is punishable. Right? Valid excuses are not, so I'll give an example. Praying your dhuhr prayer within the period of dhuhr prayer is actually a fard. It's an obligation. It is not a valid excuse to say that, well, I work and I just don't have enough time because this is the time when I have meetings and things like that. Therefore, I'll pray my dhuhr after when I come back home. It's not a valid excuse. The phrase valid excuse is actually defined. It's not how you define it. Right? So let me give you an example in that particular point of prayer. What is a valid excuse? First and foremost, a valid excuse would be something which is what we would say that arises out of a necessity or out of a dire difficulty. Right? Sorry, out of a difficulty or a dire necessity. And the definition of these two things is that if you did something which has been asked of you to do and you are in a dire situation, and by doing that obligation, it might harm you. Like you could actually have a fatality. You might get really sick. Or if you acted upon it, somebody else might die, as an example. So I'm going to use an example here in that regard. What's a valid excuse? You're a surgeon, as an example. And the surgery that you're doing requires you to be doing this surgery for 36 hours. Right? And you can't leave the table. You leave the table as a surgeon, this person would die. Now, this is a valid excuse for this would be called a dispensation. This person, as a surgeon, would be able to continue his surgery and make up his prayer later on. A mother who is nursing a child, and the child is in a situation where if the baby is not fed, it might actually be in difficulty and stress and frustration. Could in fact have their prayer be delayed. Another example: a midwife giving birth to, well, not giving birth herself, but somebody else is giving birth and she's helping out. And if she doesn't help out, then there might be actual complications, and so she actually has to attend to the person. I'm not talking about hanging around and having a chat with the person. I'm talking about if there's an actual difficulty in that regard. So understand that valid excuses are actually defined. It's not something that you can simply opinionate on. Okay, and we will talk about dispensations, I think, a bit later on, inshallah. Now, if the fard is left out from a sacred act, then the act itself is null and void. So each act itself, for example, for you to pray, firstly, prayer is fard. Praying 5 times is fard itself. In actual prayer, there are fara'id, there are actual obligations, right? For example, making sujood, making prostration is an obligation. If you pray a prayer without the prostration, your prayer is null and void. Is that making sense? Okay. And if one denies a fard act that is established through dalil qati'i, in other words, a decisive text, then he is considered a disbeliever. For somebody to say that, I don't have to pray, right? Allah is in my heart, right? This would constitute disbelief, right? There's decisive, clear texts that tell us about, firstly, the obligatory nature of prayer and how to pray. Or somebody says, well, I don't like praying like that. I want to pray by playing football. That's my way of prayer. No. There is decisive text that actually tells us how to pray. And if that is not fulfilled, or a person rejects it and says, I don't have to actually do this, this is not my way, or whatever, then this will be actually removing the person from belief itself. Moving on to wajib, understand that a fard is an obligation. We are now talking about something which is necessary, in other words, something slightly lesser than an obligation itself. And this is what we would say, something that must be done and something that should be done. Right? There's a slight difference between the two, and sometimes, in fact, it can be slightly indecisive. And this is the very reason why Imam Abu Hanifa considered that, in fact, there should be a separation between fard and wajib, because there are certain things we might not actually have clear textual proof. There might be a small amount of indecisiveness, because it could mean something else, or the action was not entirely clarified, etc. Right? Which probably leads me to answer two particular questions over here. Number one, two particular issues. So two things. Firstly, understand that when we're speaking about the Hanafi school, we are not only speaking about Imam Abu Hanifa. I think Shaykh Hamza Yusuf clarified this about Imam Malik, for example. It's the same thing for all schools. When we speak of the Hanafi school, we're speaking about a range of scholars who were students of Imam Abu Hanifa, and then the students of Imam Abu Hanifa, continuous. So right now, this is a Hanafi school, right? So the ijaza, the license of teaching, continues all the way down to the current teachers itself, and the responsibility to preserve the methodological process is always there. And so in the Hanafi school, particularly, for example, what the two of his major students, Abu Yusuf and Shaybani, in fact say and actually have written in relationship to Imam Abu Hanifa, and normally referred to as Zahir al-Riwaya, have actual weight to the school itself. So we're not speaking only about Imam Abu Hanifa, we're in fact speaking about a school. The second thing is to understand Sunnah before we come to the Sunnah itself in terms of mandub. So who can tell me what is a Sunnah? What is the technical definition of Sunnah in the aspect of definitions of actions? What I would say from an usuli perspective, rather than Sunnah in terms of you practicing something. There's a difference between the two.
As I know it, Sunnah are the sayings and the actions and what was done in front of the Prophet, and he did not he did not reject it.
Absolutely. So the Sunnah includes the sayings of the Prophet ﷺ, the qawl of him, his af'al, his actions, and his ikrar, his approvals. That any action that actually happened in front of him, he did not reject. That formulates the entire Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. So the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ is not only what he said, it's also about what he did, and therefore it's recorded in that manner. And also obviously what he approved of the other companions doing, acting in front of him, around him, and he was present at the point of time. For it is prohibited for the prophets to sit in a place and be silent on a matter in which there is a disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they would have to speak out about a disobedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Moving on to the wajib itself, the necessary, and first and foremost, that this is actually in fact it is established by a firm command, but the source text allows for possibility of interpretation. Right? There is the source text might not be entirely decisive and clear. I'll give you an example of this. In the Hanafi school, the witr prayer is wajib, right? All of the other schools, it's actually sunnah. In the Hanafi school, it's wajib. Does anybody know why it's wajib? The Prophet ﷺ never left it out, but because he never asked anybody else, and because he did not pray that in the masjid, and therefore exhorting the community to do so, Imam Abu Hanifa said, we couldn't make this fard. And it's not as simple as being just a recommended sunnah, because it's such a heavy thing that he never left. And therefore there's a dhann in this matter, there's a non-clarity on this matter, and therefore he makes it a wajib, that it really should be done, because how heavily and how important the Prophet ﷺ actually saw this particular action, this particular prayer with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To leave out a wajib act is sinful. So within prayers, for example, there are actual wajib acts, and we will speak about those inshallah. Denying a wajib act is considered corruption. In other words, to deny it will not lead you outside of your of belief, but it is considered to be sinful. It is actually corruption to your iman. And omitting a wajib act absent-mindedly requires the performance of prostration of forgetfulness in prayer. So if you leave a wajib within a prayer, for example, your rafa' yadayn in witr prayer, then you'll be required, and you forget to do that, it'll require you to do a sajda sahwa in the end. For those who are trying to figure out what sajda sahwa, etc., we'll come to those things. I'm just wanting to use some examples, so those people who are aware of those, you can actually just make a little note for yourself. Everybody should make a note of that, and when we come to those particular sections, forgetfulness, the prostration of forgetfulness, which is sajda sahwa, just put a little note. When we come to that section, you know where to look for the exact details of that. And omitting a wajib intentionally requires the prayer to be repeated. So if you say, well, I'm just going to let this go, you actually, in the Hanafi school, you actually have to repeat the prayer, right? Because it's such an important element of that. So witr prayers really do need to be made up. So we move on to what is called mandub, or the sunnah acts. Really, the definition, the best definition will be, as the book says, recommended acts. Acts which are recommended by the Prophet ﷺ. And how do we know what is recommended and what is in fact obligatory? Is the same example as I use about the door, right? You must, so the Prophet ﷺ would say, you must do this, you mustn't do this, etc. He would use other ways of saying that as well. In Arabic, there are many ways to actually say these kind of things. So those will indicate obligation. The Prophet ﷺ would say, this is from goodness, this act, and therefore this would be considered to be a recommendation. That's one way, because he said so. Another one, in terms of his actions, there would be actions that the Prophet ﷺ would do all the time, and because there's textual proof for it, it becomes an obligation. Right? The Prophet ﷺ never said to his companions, this is sunnah, this is nafil, this is fard, this is wajib. It was not like that. In fact, this is what madhab does. You would not know what is fard and what is sunnah if you do not actually have madhab. Right? That's what a madhab does, allows you to know that. So in terms of his actions, how do we know something which is not obligatory? Is because he would do something so regularly, but he would deliberately miss it a few times. So people knew that this was in fact not an obligation. So through his actions, we can also decipher and discern that certain actions in fact were not obligations. And then there were many actions which you would do oftentimes, but not as regularly. And that would be considered to be what is referred to as mustahab, or sometimes as nafil, which is a praiseworthy act. So we can tell the difference based on his actions and his sayings. So let's look at in some detail over here. Firstly, what is called a sunnah mu'akkada. This is an emphasized sunnah. It's a defined sunnah. It's mu'akkad, it's defined. So these are the acts of the Prophet ﷺ, and the companions performed most of the time and only omitted them on rare occasions. This would be a sunnah mu'akkada. For example, the 2 rak'ah sunnah prior to fajr it's a sunnah mu'akkada. The 4 rak'ah sunnah prior to dhuhr, fardh. Right? I specifically say 4 because we'll come to those discussions a bit later on. Performance of such an act is rewarded. So if you actually act on this sunnah mu'akkada, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala rewards you. But omittance is not punishable but worthy of blame. By our imitation of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves us by a textual proof of that matter.